The morning arrived grey and uncertain, the sort of English morning that promised rain but had not yet committed to delivering it. Miss Marple had woken early, as was her custom, and had settled herself in her small sitting room with a cup of Earl Grey and the village paper. She was reading about the upcoming flower show, which she intended to enter with her prized dahlias, when the telephone rang. It was unusual enough to receive a call before 9 o'clock that she answered with a certain wariness, though her voice remained composed. "Miss Marple." "It's Constable Wilkins." The young constable's voice carried the peculiar combination of excitement and nervousness that suggested he was delivering news of genuine consequence. "There's been an incident at Thornfield Manor. Sir Edmund requests your presence, if you would be so kind. I'm told you were at the garden party yesterday." Within the hour, Miss Marple found herself being driven up the long drive toward Thornfield Manor by Constable Wilkins himself. The younger man had been reluctant to elaborate, merely stating that there had been a discovery of some importance. As the manor came into view, Miss Marple observed with her usual acuity the number of vehicles already assembled near the entrance, 2 police cars and what appeared to be the medical examiner's automobile. Her heart, which had maintained its steady rhythm for 83 years, did not accelerate. She had seen enough of life to understand that such gatherings rarely indicated good news. It was Sir Edmund himself who met her at the door, and Miss Marple was struck immediately by how diminished he appeared in the morning light. His customary authority seemed to have been stripped away overnight, leaving in its place a rather tired and bewildered elderly man. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice lacking its usual crisp certainty. "The police thought it best to speak with those who were here yesterday. They're in the drawing room. It's quite dreadful, really." Miss Marple followed him through the familiar corridors of Thornfield Manor, noting as she went the various paintings and furnishings that had occupied these walls for decades. The drawing room, when they entered it, was occupied by Inspector Blackwell from the county police, a competent man of perhaps 50 years whom Miss Marple had encountered on previous occasions, and by Mrs. Bancroft, who sat rigidly on one of the velvet chairs, her face the peculiar shade of grey that shock produces. "Miss Marple," Inspector Blackwell rose as she entered. "Thank you for coming. I understand you were present at the garden party yesterday and observed the household quite thoroughly." "I was present," Miss Marple said simply, settling herself into a chair with careful deliberation, "though I cannot claim to have observed anything beyond the ordinary social interactions one expects at such a gathering. Nevertheless," the inspector continued, "we find ourselves in rather extraordinary circumstances. Last evening, after the party concluded, there was a small fire in the drawing-room fireplace. Quite contained, nothing alarming. However, when the servants were clearing the ash this morning, they discovered something quite unexpected. Behind the hearth, partially obscured by brick, was a photograph of Miss Susan Ashford and a gentleman, in what one might describe as a rather compromising embrace." Miss Marple's expression did not change, though her hands tightened infinitesimally on her walking stick. The photograph meant something significant enough that someone had felt compelled to dispose of it, or at least attempt to do so, by burning it in the fireplace. "The peculiar thing," Inspector Blackwell continued, "is that the gentleman in the photograph is not Timothy Webb, nor indeed any of the young men with whom Miss Ashford has been seen in recent months. He is, in fact, quite unmistakable, though it takes considerable nerve to recognize him in such a position. The gentleman is Mr. Charles Pettigrew." The name hung in the air of the drawing-room like a stone cast into still water, creating ripples that extended far beyond the immediate circle. Mrs. Bancroft made a small, strangled sound. Charles Pettigrew was the newly appointed headmaster of Ashford-upon-Mere's only secondary school. He was also engaged to be married to Miss Vivian Harrow, the Ashford family's houseguest, in less than 3 weeks' time. "The question becomes," Inspector Blackwell said, settling back in his chair, "who placed that photograph in the fireplace, and why? And, more pressingly, where is Mr. Pettigrew this morning? His landlady reports that he did not return to his rooms last evening." Miss Marple absorbed this information with the calm of one who has spent 8 decades learning that human nature rarely fails to produce surprises, though it frequently manages to surprise in familiar patterns. The photograph suggested secrets. The fireplace suggested someone attempting to conceal those secrets. The absence of Mr. Pettigrew suggested something considerably more sinister than a romantic indiscretion. "Has anyone spoken with Miss Harrow?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "We haven't yet," the inspector admitted. "She was resting when I arrived, and Sir Edmund was reluctant to wake her until we had gathered more information. But yes, she will need to be informed." Miss Marple gazed out the window toward the garden where, less than 24 hours earlier, guests had sipped lemonade and searched for a lost brooch. She was thinking of Susan Ashford's flushed cheeks as she emerged from the drawing room. She was thinking of the sudden collapse of Gerald's animation. She was thinking of how people invariably set themselves on paths that led inexorably toward ruin, guided by the simple human desire to hide what could not be hidden forever. The village of Ashford-upon-Mere, she reflected, was about to experience something far more consequential than the loss of an amethyst brooch. Miss Vivian Harrow was brought downstairs at 10:30, and Miss Marple observed her descent with the careful attention she had perfected over decades of village observation. The woman moved with deliberate grace, her face composed into an expression of polite concern, though her fingers betrayed her by worrying at the hem of her cardigan. It was the hands that always told the truth, Miss Marple had learned. The face could lie with practiced ease, but the hands invariably revealed what the mind attempted to conceal. "Inspector Blackwell," Miss Harrow said, her voice steady but pitched slightly higher than natural. "Sir Edmund has informed me that Mr. Pettigrew has not been located. I cannot imagine where he might be. We were to finalize arrangements for the wedding breakfast this morning." The inspector gestured toward a chair, and Miss Harrow seated herself with careful precision, her back straight, her posture that of a woman maintaining control through sheer force of will. Inspector Blackwell produced the photograph, now carefully placed in a protective envelope, and passed it to her. "Miss Harrow, do you recognize the individuals in this photograph?" Miss Marple watched as the color drained from Miss Harrow's face with remarkable speed. For a moment, it appeared she might actually faint, but she recovered herself through a visible effort, her jaw tightening as she stared at the image. "Where did you find this?" Her voice had become barely audible. "It was discovered in the drawing-room fire. Placed this morning, apparently placed there during yesterday's fire. Can you identify the gentleman?" "It is Mr. Pettigrew," Miss Harrow said quietly. "And the young woman is Miss Susan Ashford." The admission hung in the drawing-room like a particularly foul odor that no amount of opening windows could disperse. Inspector Blackwell pressed forward with the relentless logic of his profession. "When did you last see Mr. Pettigrew?" "Yesterday evening," Miss Harrow replied. "After the garden party concluded, he called at the manor. We took tea together in the morning room. He left at approximately 6 o'clock to return to his lodgings. Was his demeanor unusual in any way? He was—" Miss Harrow paused, choosing her words with evident care. "Anxious. I attributed it to the wedding preparations, but now I wonder if there was something else troubling him." It was at this moment that Gerald Ashford was brought into the drawing-room by Constable Wilkins. The young man's appearance was considerably more disarrayed than it had been at the garden party. His hair was uncombed, his shirt partially unbuttoned, and there were dark circles beneath his eyes that suggested a sleepless night. When he saw the photograph, in Miss Harrow's hands, his entire body seemed to recoil as though he had been struck. "Where did you get that?" he demanded, his voice cracking slightly. "Mr. Ashford," Inspector Blackwell said calmly. "Perhaps you could explain your knowledge of this photograph." Gerald looked from the inspector to Miss Harrow to his father, who stood near the fireplace with an expression of profound disappointment. Miss Marple, seated quietly in her corner, continued her observations with undiminished attention. "Susan and Pettigrew," Gerald said finally, his words tumbling out with the desperation of someone who could no longer contain what he had been holding. There was an understanding between them. Susan cared for him deeply, but his engagement to Miss Harrow was already arranged through family connections. Yesterday, at the garden party, Susan gave him an ultimatum. She had obtained that photograph. They had posed for it weeks ago in secret. And she told him that unless he broke his engagement, she would send the photograph to Miss Harrow herself. Miss Harrow made a small sound, something between a gasp and a cry. Sir Edmund's face had become quite purple. "You knew about this?" he demanded of his son. "And you said nothing?" "I only learned of it yesterday," Gerald protested. "Susan told me after she confronted Pettigrew. I advised her against such actions, but she was determined. She said she could not bear to watch him marry another woman when he loved her." Inspector Blackwell leaned forward. "And where is your sister now, Mr. Ashford?" There was a moment of profound silence, the sort of silence that precedes catastrophe. "She left the house this morning," Gerald said slowly, "before breakfast. She left a note saying she needed to clear her head, that she had gone for a walk to the village. But she hasn't returned, and when I read the note again, I realized it read rather like a goodbye." Miss Marple's fingers tightened on her walking stick. The missing headmaster, the distraught young woman with an ultimatum, the compromising photograph. The pieces were beginning to arrange themselves into a pattern, though not yet the complete picture. She was thinking of Susan's flushed cheeks the previous afternoon. She was thinking of the particular intensity with which she had looked at her brother when she emerged from the drawing room. She was thinking of how desperation and love, when combined in the human heart, produced a volatile and unpredictable mixture. "Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly, "has anyone thought to check the old stone ridge beyond the village? It is a rather desolate spot, and the water beneath it is quite deep, if a young person in a state of emotional distress wished to be alone with their thoughts." She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Inspector Blackwell was already rising from his chair, his face grim with the dawning understanding of what they might be about to discover. Outside, the threatened rain had finally begun to fall, turning the gardens of Thornfield Manor grey and melancholy, as though the very heavens were mourning secrets that had been revealed far too late. The stone bridge that crossed the River Ashford on the outskirts of the village was ancient, predating the village itself by several centuries. Its arches were worn smooth by generations of water and weather, and the path leading to it had become overgrown with nettles and brambles over the years. It was not a place where one typically encountered other people, which had undoubtedly made it attractive to those seeking solitude. Inspector Blackwell arrived with 3 constables in a police automobile, while Miss Marple, having insisted on accompanying them despite her age, was assisted from the vehicle by Constable Wilkins, with considerably more gentleness than she required. The rain had intensified, falling in steady sheets that obscured the landscape and made the stone of the bridge slick and treacherous. Below, the river churned with unusual vigor, swollen by the morning's precipitation. Inspector Blackwell stood at the center of the bridge, directing his men to search the banks on either side, his voice barely audible above the sound of water and wind. It was one of the younger constables who discovered her. Susan Ashford lay on a rocky outcropping perhaps 30 feet downstream, her body partially submerged in the shallow water that swirled around the stones. She was still wearing the PA. The blue dress she had worn at the garden party the previous day, now darkened and clinging to her like a shroud. Her face, when they carefully retrieved her body and laid it on the bank, bore an expression of such profound sadness that even the experienced constables seemed momentarily moved by it. Inspector Blackwell knelt beside the body, his professional demeanor evident in his methodical examination. "She's been in the water since sometime last night," he said finally. "The medical examiner will need to determine the exact cause of death, but it appears she went into the river deliberately." Miss Marple stood apart from the scene, her walking stick planted firmly in the mud, her pale eyes taking in every detail. The way Susan's dress was arranged, the absence of any signs of struggle, the positioning of her hands which lay at her sides with a terrible final repose. She was thinking of a young woman driven to desperation by love and circumstance, of a carefully staged photograph meant to force a decision, of the terrifying finality of choice made in moments of despair. "She believed he would choose her," Miss Marple said quietly to Inspector Blackwell, who had risen and was surveying the bridge itself. She had given him the photograph as an ultimatum, confident in her youth that he could not possibly reject her for the sake of propriety and family obligation. But he did reject her, didn't he? Or rather, he chose the path of least resistance, the comfortable path of duty, rather than the turbulent path of love. Inspector Blackwell regarded her with the particular respect he had developed for the elderly woman over the course of their previous interactions. "Where is Pettigrew, then?" he asked. "If Miss Ashford came here in despair over his rejection, where is he?" "That," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "is the question that requires answering, isn't it? The seer." For Charles Pettigrew began in earnest once Susan's body had been removed and arrangements made for a proper examination. Constables were dispatched throughout the village, inquiring at lodging houses, public houses, and the homes of various acquaintances. It was mid-afternoon when word came that a man matching Pettigrew's description had been observed taking the morning train to London. Inspector Blackwell immediately arranged for inquiries to be made at the London terminus. But as Miss Marple observed to Constable Wilkins with quiet certainty, such efforts would likely prove fruitless. "He will not be found in London," she said, settling herself once again in the police automobile as it returned to the village. "Or rather, he will not be found at all, at least not in any manner that would be helpful to the inspector's investigation." "Why do you say that?" Wilkins asked, bewildered. "Because," Miss Marple replied, "a man fleeing from the consequences of a young woman's despair is a man fleeing from his own conscience. Such men do not typically resurface in their ordinary lives. They disappear, Constable, they change their names and their circumstances, and they carry the weight of their cowardice with them wherever they go. The village of Ashford-upon-Mere took the news of Susan Ashford's death with the particular shock that accompanies tragedy within the social hierarchy. The daughter of Sir Edmund, a young woman of considerable beauty and accomplishment, found drowned in the river under circumstances that suggested deliberate self-destruction. The scandal was unprecedented. Speculation ran rampant through the streets and drawing rooms like a plague of locusts, consuming every detail and elaborating upon it with the creativity that only village gossip could muster. By evening, the narrative had been established: Susan Ashford, driven mad by unrequited love for her father's employee's fiancé, had taken her own life in a moment of despair. Charles Pettigrew, stricken with guilt, had fled the village. Miss Vivian Harrow, the jilted fiancée, was to be pitied for her humiliation. The Ashford family's reputation, though damaged, would recover eventually, as the reputations of the wealthy invariably do. Miss Marple, however, sat in her cottage that evening with her knitting needles and her thoughts, neither of which moved in the conventional patterns that everyone else seemed to assume. She was thinking of a photograph deliberately placed in a fireplace. She was thinking of the particular way Susan's hands had lain so peacefully at her sides. She was thinking of the absence of any note, any written expression of the despair that supposedly had driven her to the bridge. And she was thinking, with the clarity that comes only from decades of observing human nature, that the village of Ashford-upon-Mere had accepted an explanation far too convenient, far too tidy, and far too disconnected from the actual complexity of human motivation. The truth, she suspected, lay deeper still. 3 days had passed since Susan Ashford's body had been retrieved from the river, and the village had begun the peculiar process of mourning while simultaneously dissecting every aspect of the tragedy. The funeral was to be held on Friday, a somber affair that would draw most of the village to the parish church. Miss Marple had received a personal invitation from Sir Edmund, delivered by hand, requesting her presence. She had accepted with her customary grace, though her mind remained occupied with matters that extended far beyond the proper etiquette of mourning. It was on the morning of the 4th day that Inspector Blackwell called upon her. He arrived at her cottage at 10 o'clock, his face bearing the particular expression of a man who has discovered something that troubles him considerably. Miss Marple received him in her sitting-room, where she had been engaged in her correspondence, and offered him tea with the practiced hospitality that suggested she had been expecting him. "I have been thinking," the inspector began, settling into the chair she indicated, "about what you said at the bridge, about the absence of a note." "Yes," Miss Marple said simply, pouring his tea with steady hands. It troubles you as it troubles me. The medical examiner's findings are complete, Blackwell continued. Miss Ashford died by drowning, that much is certain. But there are other details that do not sit comfortably together. The dress she wore, for instance, it is of considerable quality, expensive even. Yet there are no tears in the fabric, no signs of struggle or violent contact with the rocks. She appears to have entered the water quite deliberately, almost peacefully. Miss Marple nodded, unsurprised. And there are other inconsistencies, I suspect. There are, Blackwell admitted. The position of her body, for instance. When a person drowns while entering the water deliberately, particularly if they are distressed, there are typically certain physical manifestations. Water in the lungs, certainly, but also signs of the body's final struggle. Yet Miss Ashford appears almost serene in death, as though she had been placed in the water after death, rather than entering it while alive, Miss Marple said quietly. Inspector Blackwell set down his teacup with deliberate care. I would appreciate your thoughts on a rather delicate matter. I have been making inquiries regarding the morning Susan disappeared. Her note, as Gerald described it, was found on the hall table. But I have been unable to locate the actual note itself. Gerald claims to have read it, but when asked to produce it, he stated he had burned it, believing it to be a private matter. And do you believe him? Miss Marple asked. I find that I do not, the inspector said frankly. Furthermore, I have been interviewing the servants at Thornfield Manor, and their accounts of the morning are somewhat confused. No one can definitively confirm that they saw Susan leave the house. The assumption was made because her bed had not been slept in, but as to when she actually departed, or indeed whether she departed voluntarily, the evidence is decidedly uncertain. Miss Marple rose and moved to her window, where her roses were beginning to recover from the previous day's rain, their petals beaded with moisture that caught the morning light. Tell me about Charles Pettigrew, she said without turning. A relatively unremarkable man by all accounts, Blackwell replied. 34 years old, newly appointed as headmaster, came to the village approximately 18 months ago. He secured his position through competitive examination and seemed well regarded by the school governors. His engagement to Miss Harrow was arranged by family connections. Both families have connections to the same social circles in London. And his departure from the village? He was observed purchasing a ticket to London at the railway station on the morning after Susan's body was discovered. The ticket master is certain of the day and time. From London there is no trace. Inquiries have been made to his family, but they claim to have had no contact with him since he left the village. Miss Marple turned from the window, her expression thoughtful. Inspector, I should like to ask you something rather direct. In your professional opinion, was the photograph that was found in the fireplace actually placed there during yesterday's fire, or might it have been concealed there for some time previously? Blackwell leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed. The Sir. Vance reported that the fire in the drawing room was small and controlled, lasting perhaps 20 minutes. If the photograph had been in the hearth already, it should have been consumed entirely. Yet it survived relatively intact, merely singed at the edges. One would have to conclude that it was placed there very recently, probably minutes before the fire was lit, and who had opportunity to do so? Miss Marple pressed almost anyone present at the garden party, the inspector admitted. The drawing room was not continuously occupied. Guests moved freely throughout the manor. Miss Marple returned to her chair and folded her hands in her lap with an air of finality. I believe, Inspector, that you should examine more carefully the relationships within the Ashford household itself. Specifically, I would suggest that you consider the dynamic between Gerald and his sister, and the extent to which Gerald might have been protective of his sister's interests. You think Gerald had something to do with Susan's death? Blackwell asked, his voice tight. I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that the young man is capable of significant deception. Consider, he knew about the photograph and the ultimatum Susan had issued to Pettigrew. He knew of her desperation when Pettigrew ultimately chose to maintain his engagement. And he has admitted to reading a note that he subsequently destroyed. A convenient action that eliminates evidence of Susan's state of mind. But the body in the river, Blackwell protested. That is genuine enough. Indeed it is, Miss Marple agreed. but consider whether Susan actually placed herself there. Consider whether someone who loved her, someone who could not bear to witness her slow dissolution under the weight of rejection and humiliation, might not have taken action to end her suffering. Consider whether the absence of struggle, the peaceful repose of the body, might not suggest something other than suicide. Inspector Blackwell sat in silence for several long moments, the implications of Miss Marple's words settling upon him like a heavy fog. Outside, the village continued its ordinary business, unaware that the accepted narrative of tragedy was unraveling, thread by thread, revealing something far more complicated beneath. Inspector Blackwell departed Miss Marple's cottage with considerably more questions than answers, yet armed with a new direction for his investigation. Miss Marple watched him go from her window, then returned to her knitting with the calm demeanor of one who had set events in motion and could now observe their unfolding with the detachment of a naturalist studying the behavior of insects. She had learned long ago that the revelation of truth was not her responsibility. Her role was merely to illuminate the path upon which truth might be discovered. The inspector's next action was to request that Gerald Ashford submit to a more detailed interrogation, conducted not at the manor, but at the police station in the county town. Gerald arrived at 2:30 that afternoon, accompanied by his father's solicitor, Mr. Hendricks, whose presence suggested that Sir Edmund had begun to suspect that his son's involvement might extend beyond mere knowledge of his sister's distress. It was during this interrogation, conducted in a small, austere room furnished only with a table and chairs, that Gerald Ashford's carefully maintained composure finally fractured. Inspector Blackwell, armed now with Miss Marple's observations regarding the inconsistencies in the official narrative, pressed with a persistence that left no room for evasion. "The note that you claim to have read and subsequently burned," Blackwell said, his voice steady and relentless. "Describe it for me." Gerald's fingers trembled as he reached for the glass of water that had been provided. It was brief. She said she could not face the humiliation, that she was going to end it all. And the handwriting? Was it definitely Susan's? "Of course it was," Gerald said. But there was a hesitation in his voice that suggested otherwise. "Because we have recovered samples of Susan's handwriting from her correspondence, and we have sent them to an expert for comparison. The results will be quite illuminating, I suspect." Mr. Hendricks placed a restraining hand on Gerald's arm, but the young man had already begun to unravel. His hands moved agitatedly across the table, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost its defensive edge. "She was suffering," he said finally, the words tumbling out with the desperation of confession. "Do you understand what it was like to watch your sister deteriorate day by day, knowing that the man she loved had chosen to ignore her entirely, knowing that he would marry another woman, that Susan would be forced to watch it all happen, to remain in the village and witness his happiness?" "So you wrote the note," Blackwell said quietly. "I wrote it to give her peace," Gerald continued, his eyes wild now with the intensity of someone justifying the unjustifiable. "I told her that I had a plan, that we could end this, that she could finally escape the pain. She was so relieved, Inspector. For the first time in weeks, she smiled at me. She believed that I had found a way to save her. And what did this plan entail?" Mr. Hendricks was attempting to silence his client, but Gerald was beyond such practical considerations now. "We went to the bridge that night. I had prepared something, a sleeping draught, quite strong, obtained from a pharmacist in the next county where I was not known. I told her it was something to help her rest, that it would make everything easier. She trusted me. She took it willingly, believing that I was helping her." The confession hung in the air of the interrogation room like a particularly noxious gas. Inspector Blackwell's expression remained carefully neutral, though his hands tightened imperceptibly on the table edge. "You murdered your sister," he said, the words flat and final. "I ended her suffering," Gerald corrected, but even he seemed to recognize the inadequacy of the distinction. When the draught had taken effect, when she was unconscious, and no longer experiencing the terrible pain that had consumed her, I carried her to the water. I told myself that I was doing it gently, that I was allowing her to slip away peacefully, as she would have chosen, if she had been brave enough to choose it herself. And the photograph in the fireplace. "I placed it there," Gerald admitted. "After I had done what needed to be done, I returned to the manor. I wanted to ensure that the focus of the investigation would fall on Pettigrew, that he would bear the responsibility for what had occurred. He had caused her suffering through his cruelty and cowardice. It seemed only just that he should be suspected, that he should carry the burden of guilt even if he ultimately escaped justice, and Pettigrew's departure from the village." Blackwell pressed. "I may have mentioned to him that I knew the truth about his relationship with Susan, that I had evidence that could destroy his reputation. I suggested that it might be advisable for him to leave the village immediately, before the scandal became public. He was only too eager to escape, I think. He left without even attempting to verify my claims." Gerald's head had sunk into his hands now, his voice emerging muffled and hollow. "I loved her," he said. "Everything I did because I loved her and could not bear to watch her suffer any longer." The trial of Gerald Ashford took place. 6 weeks later, conducted with all the gravity that such a case demanded. The village of Ashford-upon-Mere experienced a profound shock, the sort of disruption to the social order that comes when one of its own is revealed to be capable of such a crime. Sir Edmund aged visibly under the weight of his shame, while Lady Catherine retreated into a state of emotional withdrawal that her physicians could do little to alleviate. Miss Vivian Harrow, freed from her engagement by circumstance rather than choice, departed the village quietly and was not heard from again. Miss Marple attended the trial in person, sitting in the public gallery with her knitting, her face reflecting neither satisfaction nor condemnation. When it was over, and Gerald had been led away to serve his sentence, she returned to her cottage and to her roses, which continued their indifferent blooming regardless of human tragedy. She had solved the mystery, yes, but the solution had brought her no joy, only the familiar, bittersweet recognition that human nature, in all its complexity, remained endlessly capable of both love and cruelty in equal measure. Autumn had come to Ashford-upon-Mere with the particular gentleness that English countryside displays when summer has finally released its grip. The leaves had turned to shades of amber and rust, and the village had entered that period of relative quiet that precedes the approach of winter. 3 months had elapsed since Gerald Ashford's conviction, and the acute scandal that had consumed the village had settled into something more manageable. A permanent stain on the social fabric, certainly, but one that could be discussed now without the immediate, visceral shock that had characterized those early weeks. Miss Marple sat in her garden on a particularly fine October afternoon, her roses having produced one final defiant bloom before surrendering to the Eason's decline. She was examining a particularly sturdy specimen when she heard the gate click open and looked up to see Inspector Blackwell approaching along the garden path. His visit was unexpected, though Miss Marple had learned long ago that life frequently presented one with the unexpected, and that resistance to such presentations was invariably futile. "Miss Marple," he greeted her, removing his hat with the courtesy that had become habitual in their interactions. "I hope I am not intruding upon your afternoon." "Not in the slightest," she replied, setting down her gardening shears with deliberate care. "Do sit. I was about to take tea." Within minutes they were settled in her sitting room, where tea had been prepared with the efficiency of someone who had been expecting a visitor. Inspector Blackwell accepted his cup with evident gratitude, though Miss Marple observed that he seemed reluctant to begin whatever conversation had prompted his visit. She allowed him the silence, understanding that some matters required careful consideration before being articulated. "I have come," he began finally, "because something has troubled me since the conclusion of Gerald Ashford's trial, and I find myself unable to reconcile certain aspects of the case with the narrative that the court accepted." "Go on," Miss Marple encouraged, her expression remaining calm and attentive. "The sleeping draught that Gerald claims to have administered to his sister," Blackwell continued. "We tested the residual traces in Susan's system during the post-mortem examination. The quantity detected was insufficient to cause unconsciousness. A person given such a dose would have felt drowsy, certainly, but would have remained alert and capable of physical resistance." Miss Marple set down her teacup with the care of someone handling something precious. "And what does this suggest to you, Inspector?" "It suggests," Blackwell said slowly, "that Susan Ashford was conscious when she entered the water, It suggests that she may have gone willingly, or at least without violent resistance. It suggests, most troublingly, that Gerald's account of events may not be entirely accurate. Have you considered, Miss Marple asked delicately, the possibility that Gerald's confession was not entirely truthful, that he may have confessed to a crime he did not actually commit? Inspector Blackwell rose and began to pace the small room with the restlessness of a man confronting unwelcome truths. I have considered it, yes. But to what end? Why would he confess to murder if he had not committed it? Because, Miss Marple said quietly, he believed that someone he loved had committed it, and he was willing to sacrifice himself to protect them. The implications of this statement seemed to settle over the inspector like a physical weight. He returned to his chair and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his face bearing the expression of a man glimpsing a truth he was not certain he wished to understand. "Sir Edmund," Miss Marple continued, her voice remaining remarkably steady, "consider what we know of him. A man of considerable pride and social standing, accustomed to controlling every aspect of his life and the lives of those dependent upon him. A man who had already experienced the humiliation of his son's mysterious departure from his London firm. And then his daughter, the young woman he had raised and educated, engaged in a scandalous affair with the headmaster, threatening to expose photographs that would destroy the family's reputation, and his own carefully constructed social position. "You believe Sir Edmund killed his daughter?" Blackwell asked, his voice barely audible. "I believe," Miss Marple said, "that Sir Edmund discovered the truth about Susan and Pettigrew. I believe that he may have confronted her, that in his fury and shame he may have taken action that he subsequently regretted, and I believe that when Gerald witnessed his father's distress, when he realized what had occurred, he determined to shield his father from the consequences of a crime committed in a moment of rage and humiliation." Inspector Blackwell was silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming soundlessly against the armrest of his chair. "The evidence that Gerald confessed would be difficult to overturn," he said finally. "He has already been tried and convicted. The courts are unlikely to revisit a case in which the defendant himself has admitted guilt." "I am aware of that," Miss Marple replied, "which is precisely why I am speaking to you now rather than to a court of law. Some truths, Inspector, are not meant to be pursued through the machinery of justice. Some truths exist in that peculiar space between what can be proven and what can be known. Sir Edmund has lost his son to prison and his daughter to death. Lady Catherine may never recover from the knowledge of what has transpired within her own home. The village has experienced a profound disruption to the order upon which it depends. Is further revelation of the truth truly in anyone's interest?" Blackwell stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the garden, where the roses continued their indifferent blooming. "You are asking me to accept a false conviction, to allow an innocent man to serve a sentence he does not deserve. I am asking you to consider," Miss Marple said gently, "the difference between justice and mercy, and whether there are circumstances in which the pursuit of absolute truth may cause more harm than the acceptance of a necessary fiction." The inspector did not respond immediately. When he finally turned from the window, his face bore an expression of profound weariness. "If I were to pursue this matter further," he said quietly, "it would destroy what remains of the Ashford family entirely. Sir Edmund would face prosecution. Lady Catherine would lose her husband as well as her children. The village would be consumed by scandal that would dwarf what we have already experienced." "Yes," Miss Marple said simply, "that is precisely what would occur." Inspector Blackwell replaced his hat and moved toward the door with the bearing of a man who has made a decision he cannot reverse. "Thank you for the tea, Miss Marple," he said formally. "I find that I am no longer troubled by inconsistencies in the case. Some mysteries, I have concluded, are better left unsolved." Miss Marple nodded, unsurprised by his decision. She had understood from the beginning that truth was a far more complex commodity than most people imagined, and that wisdom sometimes lay not in its pursuit, but in its merciful concealment. The visit from Inspector Blackwell had precipitated a shift in Miss Marple's understanding of the case that she found herself unable to ignore, though she maintained her customary composure in the presence of the village. She had spoken the truth to the inspector with deliberate care, yet she had not anticipated the particular way in which her words would unsettle the careful equilibrium she had helped to establish. Ish. Truth, she reflected, was like a stone cast into still water. It created ripples that extended far beyond the point of impact, disrupting surfaces one had believed to be settled and stable. It was therefore with a certain inevitability that she received a visitor on the evening of the following day. Sir Edmund Ashford appeared at her door at 6:30, at that peculiar hour when daylight was surrendering to darkness, and the village seemed suspended between day and night. He was alone, without attendants or the social armor that his position typically afforded him. His face was haggard, and his hands trembled slightly as he accepted her invitation to enter. "I have come," he said without preamble, settling into the chair that Miss Marple indicated, "because I have been informed that you have spoken to Inspector Blackwell regarding the true circumstances of my daughter's death." Miss Marple did not confirm or deny this assertion. Instead, she rose and busied herself with the preparation of brandy, which she poured into 2 small glasses with the deliberate movements of someone engaged in a task that required concentration. She had learned that silence, properly deployed, was often more effective than any amount of explanation. Sir Edmund accepted the brandy and drank it in a single swallow, as though the alcohol were medicine rather than beverage. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You believe that I killed her," he said, "that I discovered her indiscretion with Pettigrew, and in my rage I took her life. I believe," Miss Marple said carefully, "that you are a man who has experienced considerable suffering, and that the suffering has its origins in events that occurred within your own home." Sir Edmund's hands clenched into fists, and for a moment Miss Marple thought he might succumb to the violent emotions that were clearly churning beneath his carefully maintained exterior. Instead, he seemed to collapse inward, his shoulders sagging as though the weight he carried had suddenly become unbearable. "The photograph," he said. "I discovered it in the drawing room, behind the cushions of one of the chairs. I was searching for a book I had mislaid, and there it was, my daughter, in the arms of that man, displayed with such intimacy, such lack of shame." "And what did you do?" Miss Marple asked gently. "I confronted her," Sir Edmund continued, his voice monotone now, as though he were recounting events that had occurred to someone else entirely. "I demanded an explanation. She defended herself with a courage I found both admirable and infuriating. She said she loved him, that she could not help her feelings, that she intended to ensure he honored those feelings by breaking his engagement to Miss Harrow." Sir Edmund rose abruptly and began to pace the small room much as Inspector Blackwell had done the previous afternoon. "I told her that such behavior was unconscionable, that she had brought disgrace upon the family name, that her actions could result in social ruin not only for herself but for all of us. She refused to listen. She spoke as though she believed her love entitled her to defy the very foundations of propriety and honor upon which our society is constructed. And then," Miss Marple pressed, though she believed she already knew the answer. "There was a struggle," Sir Edmund said, and his voice cracked with the weight of confession. "I attempted to take the photograph from her, to destroy it before anyone else could see it. She resisted. We fought, and in that struggle she struck her head against the corner of the mantelpiece. It was an accident, Miss Marple, an accident born of my own fury and her stubborn defiance." Sir Edmund sank back into his chair, his face ashen. "She was unconscious when I realized what had happened. I attempted to revive her, but she would not wake. I panicked. I thought of the scandal, of the shame, of everything that would be destroyed by the revelation of what had occurred. And in my panic, I conceived of a plan to make it appear that she had taken her own life, that the shame of her indiscretion had driven her to despair." "You placed her in the river," Miss Marple said quietly. "I carried her to the bridge," Sir Edmund confirmed. "I told myself that it was a mercy, that the blow to her head had perhaps already ended her life, that I was merely arranging matters to minimize the pain inflicted upon the rest of the family. But the truth, Miss Marple, is that I do not know if she was dead when I placed her in the water. I do not know if, in my desperation to conceal my guilt, I actually took my daughter's life a second time." The confession hung in the drawing room like a particularly foul miasma, and Miss Marple found herself experiencing an unexpected surge of compassion for this broken man who had constructed an elaborate deception, only to discover that the truth was far more unbearable than any amount of concealment could render it. "Gerald knows," Sir Edmund continued. "I do not know how he learned the truth, whether he witnessed the confrontation or whether he pieced together the circumstances afterward, but he knows. And when he was questioned by the police, he chose to confess in my place. He chose to sacrifice his own freedom to protect his father." "A son's love," Miss Marple observed, expressed in the only language that seemed available to him. "I have visited him in prison," Sir Edmund said. "I have attempted to convince him to recant his confession, to tell the authorities the truth, but he refuses. He tells me that his sacrifice is the only thing that remains to him that has any meaning, that if he can protect me from prosecution, then perhaps his actions will have accomplished something of value." Sir Edmund finished his brandy and set the glass on the side table with deliberate care. "I came here to ask you, Miss Marple, what you intend to do with the knowledge that you possess. Do you plan to reveal what you have deduced? Do you plan to ensure that justice is properly served, even if that justice destroys what remains of my family?" Miss Marple gazed at the old man before her, seeing in him not a murderer but a human being, confronting the terrible consequences of a moment's rage and years of suppressed emotion. She thought of Susan, dead by accident rather than design, but dead nonetheless. She thought of Gerald, serving a sentence for a crime he did not commit. She thought of Lady Catherine and the other innocent parties who would suffer if the truth were fully exposed. "I intend," she said finally, "to do nothing." Sir Edmund's relief at Miss Marple's declaration was palpable, yet it was immediately replaced by a more complex emotion, something approaching horror at the realization that she had, in essence, made herself complicit in the concealment of his crime. He rose from his chair with the movements of an old man, his earlier dignity entirely stripped away, leaving only a hollow shell of his former self. "You would protect me," he said, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. "Despite knowing what I have done, despite understanding that an innocent man is serving time for my crime, I would protect nothing and no one," Miss Marple corrected gently. "I would merely refrain from action that would cause further suffering to those already devastated by tragedy. There is a distinction, though admittedly a subtle one." "But Gerald," Sir Edmund protested, "my son is imprisoned for a crime he did not commit. Surely that injustice demands redress." "Gerald," Miss Marple said, "why?" Unexpected firmness, made a choice. He chose, with full knowledge of the consequences, to sacrifice his own freedom in order to protect you. That choice was his to make, and it was made deliberately and with considerable courage. To overturn it now would be to negate the very sacrifice he has made, to render his suffering meaningless, and to transform it from an act of love into merely another tragedy. Sir Edmund seemed to struggle with this logic, his face working through a series of conflicting emotions before settling into something that resembled grim acceptance. He moved toward the window, gazing out into the gathering darkness, where the village lights were beginning to appear like small flames puncturing the night. "I have been punished," he said quietly. "Not by the law, but by something far more severe. I live each day knowing what I have done, knowing that my rage and shame resulted in my daughter's death. I see Gerald's face in my mind constantly, and I understand that I have destroyed him as surely as I destroyed her. The weight of this knowledge is a far more effective prison than any physical cell could ever be." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, and her voice carried a note of genuine sorrow. "I believe that to be true. Then why?" Sir Edmund turned to face her, his eyes searching hers for some explanation that might make sense of her extraordinary mercy. "Why would you choose to remain silent about something so grave?" Miss Marple set down her untouched brandy and folded her hands in her lap with characteristic precision. "Because," she said, "I have spent 83 years observing human nature, and I have learned that punishment, however necessary it may seem, rarely accomplishes what we believe it will accomplish. The law exists to maintain order and to provide consequences for transgression. But I am not the law, nor am I an instrument of it. I am merely an elderly woman who has come to understand that the exercise of moral judgment is far more complex than simple questions of right and wrong. "You are suggesting," Sir Edmund said slowly, "that some crimes ought to remain unpunished." "I am suggesting," Miss Marple replied, "that some punishments are already sufficiently severe that the addition of legal consequences becomes something approaching cruelty. Your daughter is dead. Your son is imprisoned. Your wife is diminished by grief. Your reputation, though it has survived, is permanently altered. Your peace of mind has been destroyed. At what point does the accumulation of suffering constitute justice sufficient?" Sir Edmund sank into the chair he had vacated, his body suddenly seeming too heavy for him to sustain upright. "I do not deserve your mercy," he said finally. "No," Miss Marple agreed with characteristic bluntness. "You do not. But mercy, by its very nature, is not something that one deserves. If it were, it would not be mercy. It would merely be another form of justice." The two sat in silence for several minutes, the only sound the ticking of the clock on Miss Marple's mantelpiece and the occasional whisper of wind through the autumn branches outside. When Sir Edmund finally rose to leave, he seemed diminished, as though the conversation had drained some essential vitality from him. "I do not know how to live with this," he said at the threshold. "One does not live with such knowledge," Miss Marple said quietly. "One lives despite it. One acknowledges its existence each day and chooses each day to continue living. It is a difficult discipline, but not an impossible one." After Sir Edmund had departed, Miss Marple sat alone in her sitting room for a considerable length of time, her hands folded in her lap, her expression reflecting emotions that were not easily categorized as either satisfaction or distress. She had solved the mystery, yes, but the solution had come at a cost she was only beginning to understand. She had chosen mercy over justice, and she would need to live with the consequences of that choice. Outside, the November fog was beginning to settle over the village, obscuring the familiar landmarks and rendering everything slightly uncertain and dreamlike. Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, where she stood watching as the lights of Ashford-upon-Mere began to disappear one by one behind the advancing mist. Somewhere in that darkness, Sir Edmund was returning to Thornfield Manor, to his wife, and to the burden of his secret. Somewhere else, in a prison cell in the county town, Gerald Ashford was enduring the consequences of a choice made in love. And in the churchyard, beneath a stone bearing her name, Susan Ashford remained eternally frozen at the moment of her tragic end. The village would move forward, as villages always did. The scandal would fade into the sort of half-remembered gossip that no longer provoked passionate argument, but merely nostalgic recollection. Life would resume its ordinary patterns, and Miss Marple would continue to sit in her garden, tending her roses and observing the complexities of human nature with the same patient attention she had brought to bear for decades. Justice, she had learned, was a far less certain commodity than most people believed. Winter came early to Ashford-upon-Mere that year, with the first snow arriving in mid-November, transforming the village into something approximating a Christmas illustration in a Victorian children's book. The snow fell silently and persistently, covering the rooftops and the gardens, muffling sound and softening the harsh angles of the stone buildings. It was the sort of snow that made one feel isolated from the rest of the world, as though the village had been removed entirely from the ordinary flow of human experience. It was during this season of enforced solitude that Miss Marple received a letter. The handwriting was neat and careful, executed with the sort of precision that comes from having considerable time to devote to such matters. The letter bore the postmark of the prison where Gerald Ashford was serving his sentence, and Miss Marple held it for several moments before opening it, as though delaying the act might somehow change what she knew it would contain. The letter was addressed to her with formal courtesy, and the contents, once she had settled herself with her reading glasses and her customary cup of tea, revealed something approaching a confession of its own. "Dear Miss Marple," it began, "I hope you will forgive the liberty I take in writing to you, though I suspect you will not be entirely surprised to receive this letter. I have had considerable time during my imprisonment to reflect upon the events that led to my current circumstances, and I find myself compelled to address certain matters that I believe require clarification. Miss Marple read on, her expression remaining carefully neutral, though her hands tightened slightly on the letter as she progressed through its contents. "You were correct in your deductions regarding the true circumstances of my sister's death," the letter continued. "However, I believe you may not have understood the complete truth of the situation. It was not my father alone who was responsible for what occurred that evening. I was present at Thornfield Manor when he discovered the photograph. I witnessed his confrontation with Susan, and when the struggle occurred, when she fell against the mantelpiece and struck her head, I was standing in the doorway." Miss Marple set the letter down momentarily, her mind racing through the implications of what she was reading. She had constructed her understanding of events based on certain assumptions, and she was now confronted with the possibility that those assumptions had been incomplete or even erroneous. The letter continued, "I could have called for help. I could have summoned the servants or sent for the doctor. Instead, I stood there, paralyzed by shock and the sudden realization that my father's rage had resulted in catastrophe. And when father began to move Susan's body, when he spoke of concealing what had happened, I did not protest. I did not intervene. My silence became complicity, and my complicity became, in a sense, its own form of guilt." Miss Marple found herself leaning forward, entirely absorbed in the narrative that Gerald was constructing from his cell. She understood now that she had missed something crucial in her original analysis, that her confident deduction had been built upon an incomplete foundation. When the police began their investigation, Gerald's letter continued, "I realized that father would be discovered as the author of the tragedy. I could not bear it, not because I sought to protect him from justice, though I did wish to protect him from the agony of public trial and condemnation, but because I realized that my own silence made me equally culpable. I had stood by and allowed a crime to occur without intervention. In confessing to the crime myself, I was not protecting father from his guilt, I was assuming responsibility for my own." The letter went on to explain in meticulous detail the sequence of events as Gerald had experienced them. The shock of witnessing his sister's death, the paralysis that had gripped him, and the gradual realization that his father had taken action to conceal what had happened. Gerald wrote with surprising clarity about the moral complexities of his situation, the knowledge that his father had acted in rage rather than premeditation, the UND, a standing that the family would be destroyed if the truth emerged, and the conviction that his own sacrifice might somehow constitute a form of redemption for his inaction in that crucial moment. "When I confessed," he wrote, "I did so with full knowledge that I was committing perjury, that I was perverting the course of justice, and that I was condemning myself to years of imprisonment for a crime I did not commit. But I did so willingly, Miss Marple, because I believed that it was the only action available to me that might contain the damage that had been done. In confessing falsely, I was at least acting, at least taking responsibility for something, rather than remaining paralyzed as I had been in that terrible moment when my sister fell." The letter concluded with a request that struck Miss Marple with considerable force. "I ask you," Gerald wrote, "to continue to remain silent regarding what you have deduced, not to protect my father, but because I have come to understand that some truths, once released into the world, create consequences that extend far beyond the individuals directly involved. The village has accepted a narrative. My family has achieved, if not peace, at least a form of stability around that narrative, and I have found, in my imprisonment, a strange sort of purpose. The knowledge that my sacrifice means something, that it has been undertaken consciously and deliberately rather than imposed upon me by external forces." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer of her escritoire where she kept her most private correspondence. She sat for a long time afterward, staring out the window at the snow-covered garden, contemplating the layers of complexity that underlay the apparent simplicity of events. She had believed herself to possess complete understanding of the tragedy that had befallen the Ashford family. She had read that her deductions had revealed the full truth. Yet here was Gerald from his prison cell, suggesting that even her penetrating observations had failed to encompass the entire scope of what had actually occurred. The photograph that had been lost behind the hearth had contained secrets within secrets, and the truth that lay beneath the photograph's concealment was perhaps even more tragic than she had initially understood. Winter pressed on around the village, and Miss Marple continued her quiet life, never revealing to anyone the contents of Gerald's letter, never sharing with Inspector Blackwell or anyone else the nuanced understanding she had gained of the events that had unfolded. Some mysteries, she reflected, remained best left in shadow. Spring arrived in Ashford-upon-Mere with the tentative optimism that seasons always bring, as though the turning of the year might somehow erase the tragedies of the previous months. The gardens began their annual resurrection, pushing forth green shoots and tentative buds, and the village seemed to exhale collectively, as though it had been holding its breath through the long winter and could now finally resume its ordinary patterns of existence. Miss Marple, standing in her garden on a particularly fine April morning, observed the appearance of her first daffodils with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had learned to find pleasure in the small continuities of nature. It was on this morning that she received a visitor unexpected in neither his arrival nor his purpose. Inspector Blackwell appeared at her cottage door at 10 o'clock precisely, and Miss Marple received him with the composure of someone who had anticipated his coming, though she could not have specified exactly when or why. "I have come," he said without preamble, settling into the familiar chair, "because I find myself unable to close the file on the ash. Ford case. There are certain matters that do not sit comfortably with the conclusions we have reached, and I believe that you are the only person who might provide illumination regarding them." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, offering him tea, which he accepted with evident gratitude. "Gerald Ashford has written to the governor of his prison requesting that certain information be conveyed to me," Blackwell continued. "Information suggesting that his confession, while technically accurate, may not represent the complete truth of what transpired on the evening of his sister's death." Miss Marple remained silent, her attention apparently focused entirely on the proper arrangement of sugar in her teacup. "Gerald suggests," Blackwell pressed forward, "that he was present at Thornfield Manor when the confrontation between Sir Edmund and Susan occurred. He indicates that he witnessed the fatal accident but failed to intervene. He is now requesting that I investigate whether his inaction constitutes a form of culpability that should be noted in his official record." "And what do you believe, Inspector?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Blackwell set down his teacup with deliberate care. "I believe," he said slowly, "that a young man in the presence of a terrible accident, paralyzed by shock and unable to act, is not culpable in the manner that a premeditated murderer might be. I believe that Gerald Ashford has spent months in prison, not for a crime he committed, but for a failure to act in a moment of crisis, a failure that, while perhaps morally questionable, does not rise to the level of murder." "And what will you do with this belief?" Miss Marple inquired. "I find myself in a peculiar position," Blackwell admitted. "If I were to pursue the matter further, if I were to conduct a new investigation based on Gerald's letter, I would inevitably expose Sir Edmund's role in his daughter's death. I would likely uncover evidence that would necessitate his prosecution for manslaughter, if not murder. I would destroy what remains of the Ashford family. And I would accomplish all of this in the service of releasing a young man from prison who has apparently come to terms with his circumstances and has requested no such intervention." Miss Marple nodded slowly, as though confirming something she had long understood. "I have come to you," Blackwell continued, "because I need to understand how you arrived at your conclusions regarding Sir Edmund's involvement, and because I need to know whether you believe that justice has been served in this case." Miss Marple rose and moved to her window, where the spring sunshine was illuminating the garden with particular clarity. She stood there for a long moment before responding. "Justice," she said finally, "is a concept that we believe ourselves to understand, Inspector, but which becomes increasingly elusive the more closely we examine it. We imagine that justice consists of the guilty being punished and the innocent being protected. Yet the actual world is far more complex. In this case, we have a young woman who died as a result of her father's rage provoked by her own actions and choices. We have a father who, in attempting to conceal his crime, created additional suffering for those around him. We have a son who, in attempting to protect his father through self-sacrifice, created a different form of tragedy. And we have a headmaster who, through his own moral weakness, precipitated the entire sequence of events. But who among them is truly guilty? Blackwell asked. All of them, Miss Marple said simply, and none of them. Susan died because she believed that love could overcome propriety and family obligation. Sir Edmund acted from rage born of shame and the desire to protect his family's reputation. Gera. LD remained silent from shock and a misguided attempt at redemption, and Pettigrew fled from cowardice and self-interest. Each action was wrong. Each action was also comprehensible, given the circumstances that prompted it. Inspector Blackwell rose and moved to stand beside her at the window. "What would you have me do?" he asked. "I would have you," Miss Marple said, "do what your conscience tells you is right. I would note that Gerald has requested no intervention on his behalf, that he appears to have achieved a form of peace through acceptance of his circumstances. I would consider whether the additional suffering that would result from a new investigation would serve any purpose beyond the satisfaction of abstract principles. And I would remember that the law exists not merely to punish wrongdoing, but to maintain the social order upon which we all depend." "You are asking me to abandon my duty as an officer of the law," Blackwell said quietly. "I am asking you," Miss Marple corrected gently, "to consider whether duty and justice are always synonymous. I am asking you to reflect upon the difference between what can be proven and what can be known. And I am asking you to recognize that there are circumstances in which the pursuit of perfect justice creates consequences that are themselves unjust." Inspector Blackwell stood in silence for a considerable time, gazing out at the garden where the spring flowers continued their indifferent blooming, unaware that human beings above them were engaged in debates regarding justice and mercy, guilt and innocence, duty and compassion. "I will close the file," he said finally. "Gerald Ashford will serve his sentence, and I will record his letter as a request for no further action. The case will be marked as solved, and no additional investigation will be undertaken." "That seems," Miss Marple said, "a wise decision." After the inspector had departed, Miss Marple returned to her garden, where she knelt carefully to tend her flowers. The photograph that had been lost behind the hearth had been found, and in being found, it had revealed truths that extended far beyond the simple documentation of an indiscretion. It had revealed the terrible complexity of human motivation, the way that love and rage and shame and duty could become so entangled that untangling them required not merely investigation but wisdom. The village of Ashford-upon-Mere would move forward. Life would continue. And Miss Marple, in her quiet way, would remember that the greatest mysteries were not those involving murder and deception, but those involving the human heart, that organ that remained eternally capable of both extraordinary cruelty and extraordinary love in equal measure.